Well, that's rolling, so let's get started with a prayer. Heavenly Father, as this year comes to a close, we're grateful for all the blessings you have given us in it. We're grateful for this time to gather together as Christians, as iron sharpens iron, so we help one another in our faith and our walk as we try to do our best to be followers of Christ. Help us, Father, in all we do to seek and do your will, and in his name we pray. Amen. So it was 2 weeks ago. I suppose that makes this recap a little more important. We saw Moses grow up. He, of course, grows up in Egypt. He's born to the Hebrews that are slaves to Egypt in the land of Goshen. God calls him from the land of Midian, where he's with his father-in-law Jethro at Mount Sinai, and says, "You're going to go free my people." He tells Pharaoh, "Let my people go." We have the plagues begin, and we saw that there's a geographical separation between Goshen and where Pharaoh probably was. God has built in a buffer long before this Pharaoh ever had power or ever thought anything. Before his grandmother was a twinkle in his grandfather's eye, God had already put a separation to help protect his people. Of course, that's not to say he can't just use his own hand to do it. But the plagues began. There's a separation between the capital of Egypt and Goshen, and we saw the actual Exodus begin. They leave Egypt. Pharaoh has enough after the plagues. He says, "Get out of here." The Israelites start going out, and then we're going to see how things change from there. This is a map I referenced 2 weeks ago. I thought I would get to it, and then this week I decided I was going to move it up to the start just for fun. I would love to give proper credit for this map. Unfortunately, whoever posted it deleted their account. So the image survives, but I can't tell you who actually generated this. This is meant to show the population density of the Sinai Peninsula. So you can see it is all along the Nile. People don't live out here. There's all this space that's desert, and people do not live there. So the Israelites are up in a populated region, but then when they start traveling this way, they're getting out of civilization very, very quickly. It also means that the more direct route towards the promised land is going to be where everybody is. So that's where all of Pharaoh's armies and soldiers and whatnot are going to be. That's where the borders are, which are going to have the most protections. And that means that when God takes them in a different direction, he's taking them away from the strongholds that exist. And I'm going to hold off on that other thought for another slide. But also, there is actually population on here, but they're hard to see. So I don't blame you if this all looks white, but in fact, there are some dots. Like here's a little one right here. So there is population that's here, they're scattered throughout, but there's not a lot going on in this area. And this is a more modern map. So imagine in ancient times, it's probably even worse than this. So the Exodus has begun, and we read in Exodus 13, after leaving Sukkah, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night, a pillar of fire to give them light. So we're going to see on a couple instances that there's dispute over what route the Exodus took. And it's primarily built around the idea of where is Mount Sinai. More about that in a little bit. This particular map is BibleHistory.com because I'm trying to cite my sources. When Pharaoh is chasing the Israelites, they seem to be right in this area. So they're at the northern edge of the Red Sea when we see the crossing. This is eastern Egypt, and it says that it is near Migdal, something like that, something else maybe. So in this map, they favor that Mount Sinai is down here on what's the modern-day Sinai Peninsula. Be a better map for this later, but there's a dispute that says Mount Sinai is actually over here. Migdal is a Hebrew word for a tower or an elevated stage. So it appears to be some kind of fortification for Egypt that we're talking about at this point. And it would make sense that they would have some kind of guard tower looking over the sea to make sure nobody's coming up the sea to invade them. This is very similar in the Hebrew word is similar to the Egyptian word for stronghold. I didn't always write these down because it's not like I was going to pronounce them anyways. But the Hebrew and the Egyptian words are very similar here. The Egyptian word is fort or stronghold. And as I mentioned, God seems to be keeping them from any kind of fighting yet. They've got around 600,000 fighting men in Israel. But God is saying, you're not ready for that kind of thing yet. It's worth keeping in mind who we're talking about here. These people have just come out of slavery in Egypt. This is not a built-up, developed state yet. An area that has built up a government, built up its way of life and everything like that. So there's something fundamental that they may not have yet, and that's any kind of weapons. They've been farmers. They've been building bricks. They've been doing slave labor. They probably have agriculture tools. I'm not saying you could just go up to them with a stick and do anything you wanted to, but they don't have a professional army. They haven't fought in a battle yet. They haven't practiced for a battle yet. They haven't been positioned for anything like that yet. So God seems to be keeping them from a battle just yet. Go ahead, Ed.
Also, psychologically, they're not ready for this. Their commitment is not very strong. You see that because they want to give up every
2 seconds they want to give up. You're absolutely right.
There's a hardship of some kind or whatever, so they don't have a commitment, and it takes a commitment if you're going to fight a battle. Even if you have some of those tools, but you're right, they didn't have anything to begin to work with, but also they didn't have the will or commitment to do it.
Yeah, so very notable that it's not just physical worldly tools. They don't have the spiritual tools yet, as goes to Ed's point. In this, I think we're going to see one of the most fundamental things that the Israelites need is a reliance on God. And he's trying to train that from them first before we go around getting into fights left and right. All right. So we're at the Red Sea in Exodus chapter 14. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. We see in other recountings of those events that they were confused within a cloud at the time. So I think we've all driven through fog and know how hard it can be to see sometimes. So the Pharaoh's army is trying to figure out where they are as they're still trying to chase after the Israelites. That's not working out too well. And the next thing they know, they're in the riverbed. Well, they don't know they're in a riverbed because it's dry ground until God drops the veil, and then they find out what's really going on. So where is this Red Sea parting at? A part of it is going to depend on what the definition of the Red Sea is. This is the map I mentioned earlier that references 2 different locations for Mount Sinai. Primarily, we've looked at this location, and it's going to make even more sense later on. But I still favor this location personally. That's not to say it's right. God didn't give us GPS coordinates and tell us this is the one. This has nothing to do with getting to heaven. But I think this is the more persuasive spot. However, just so that I have been fair, there's another theory that says this blue route is more the direction towards Mount Sinai, and the Red Sea crossing is this gulf instead of this one. Under that definition, all of this is the Red Sea. So both of these gulfs are considered the Red Sea under that definition. And thus, when they cross the Red Sea, they're doing it on the second gulf, the more eastern one.
But when you look at that, look at the distance though. This happened, they're crossing the Red Sea early on when they're leaving Egypt. So to me, that would not make sense. The blue route would be anything, would be where the crossing was. To me, it seemed like, and it's all an opinion. That,
Yeah, it is.
That, just that it would be the red route because it's closer to where they started, which,
Yeah. Closer is a big factor because we only see about 6 days mentioned early on. So that's to your point. Go ahead.
Where is the pile of the stones that they had there? That should tell us which one.
That wouldn't survive to this day. That would certainly be a
they
thing
protected.
for the Israelites. Well, this is out of their hands. This is in Egyptian hands for 2,000 years. Well, 2,000 years to get to Christ. So
Okay.
then you're talking 4,000 years ago, and storms and raiders and somebody who just says, "Oh, this pile of rocks looks nice," but no, there's not a designated area where we can go point to and say, "Here's this monument that clearly shows this is where something was." It's something that would be very contemporary. The Israelites would know it at the time. Okay, so mention the days. I'll just do this real quick. So from Goshen to before the Red Sea, that's mentioned as 3 days. Go ahead.
When we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned something to Craig Ross, and I said, wow, it seems like there should be chariots and, things at the bottom of the sea that people have dug up or something. And because I had read that there had been. And he said, they have done that. And I get home, and there's an article in my, somebody's listening to us. There's an
All the time.
article in my news feed about finding a chariot or finding some, weapon or something at the bottom of the Red Sea.
Mhm.
So I just thought that was interesting because there should be some.
Which one?
Some
Which
evidence.
one?
Which Red Sea?
Which Red Sea?
I know.
Curious if you can settle the great debate of which sea it was.
It would-
The other thing to keep in mind, though, is this is before pressure treated wood, as we would know it. And also,
but they have
this is not a rainy climate by any means. The water comes from underground. So these aren't going to be weatherproofed like we might build something out of wood today, but metalwork would be much more likely to survive. So that would probably be like edges and bracing kind of things are more likely to survive underwater than actual hunks of wood would. Odd sentence. I found this noteworthy. The Exodus is actually mentioned in the Quran. I didn't quote it. I'm not going to quote the Quran, but if you want to search this topic, you can see they actually do make reference to the Israelites leaving Egypt in the Quran. And I thought that's particularly interesting because you talk about all the hostility to our faith. If anybody's hostile to anyone, you would expect the Quran to be kind of hostile to the Jewish history when it says that the Jews were never in Judea. It says the Israelites were never in the land of Israel, the promised land. They say, no, that was always us. That's what they claim. But they still mention the Exodus as happening. So the next time you hear someone with a shallow, deep understanding of anything saying there's no historical evidence about the Exodus, well, the Quran is something. It's written much later. It's going to be written 3,000 years later, but it's closer to then than we are today, and they certainly believed that that was a thing. The Septuagint translates the Hebrew wording here as Etherian Sea and Erythrea. However, that's actually supposed to be pronounced, literally means red. Now, noteworthy is that the Hebrew word is not red. They are contemporaneously, and this is very close to the time of Jesus when they're translating the Septuagint, what they're saying the Hebrew word means is what they called the Red Sea at that time, which is what we call the Red Sea today. So, for that part of the debate, when they're translating the Septuagint, they're saying it's this. And I thought that was noteworthy because that's what Jewish scholars of the time said. Okay. This map is from ArmstrongInstitute.org. This is a Bible study organization that exists. They absolutely favor the red route. They have done an extensive breakdown in the article that this map comes from if you wanted to read more and understand what that debate really is. And as they describe it, the red route is the traditional one, and the blue route is the more modern one where they think the Israelites went east out of Egypt instead of crossing at what we would call the Red Sea. All right. Lots of fun on which one's the Red Sea. The Exodus. We have crossed the Red Sea, and now we're in the desert of Shur. This was also part of the reason for the dispute is because they think the desert of Shur is up north on the peninsula instead of down south on the peninsula. So that's what the blue route people are hanging their hat on. Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days, they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Moriah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That is why the place is called Moriah. So Moriah means bitter. They're calling it that based on the water. And it's a 3-day journey from the Red Sea crossing. This journey is also mentioned in the Book of Numbers. Book of Numbers recaps the various places that the Israelites set up camp on this journey. The dispute over Mount Sinai's location gives the two route theory. We're following here the one on the Sinai Peninsula versus the one that's over on the Arabian Peninsula. But if you follow this theory, then they had come up to camp here, they crossed the Red Sea, and then 3 days later, they're back near the Red Sea when they come to Moriah.
So Caleb, are you saying they don't know where Mount Sinai is?
It's a disputed location. There's a traditional location, and there's other scholars who say, well, not so fast. We think it's over here.
Seems like that's something that would just come down and not change.
A couple of weeks ago, we looked at the fact there was a cathedral on what they say is Mount Sinai, and that's been there since the time of Rome. It was certainly there under Constantine, and they asked his mother to help fund and protect that cathedral. And that's this location for Mount Sinai. It's the one we're talking about. So that's the one that I have reason to believe it is. And we still haven't even gotten to the strongest reason why yet. But I want to be fair to everything, and I don't want to say with certainty that something is here when I can't prove it. So if there's conflicting theories on it, I think the best approach for me is to just tell you, some people say it's here, some people say it's here. I'll tell you the reasons as best I can for both positions. I stole that from a class on Revelation. The way the teacher did it was he put the 4 major interpretations for each passage out and just explained what they are, which I thought was a clever way to do that. Okay, so we have Moriah, which means bitter. We have in the Hebrew people here over 1 million individuals that are traveling. That's a lot of water that you need, plus all their camels, their herds that we know that they have, that they left Egypt with. They need a lot of water. So it makes sense to kind of hug the sea, hug the river, try to stay near water as much as you can without getting into fights with anybody over it. This is a Wikipedia article, just gave us a picture of a desert well to kind of give a picture of what we might be looking at when they're accessing this underground water, these springs that exist. About 2 to 3 miles east of the Red Sea is this possible location for Moriah. And if this looks like the literal middle of nowhere to you, yes. There is nobody around here. There's a well around here, I guess, but until you go a couple miles away, there is just absolutely nothing in this area of the Sinai Peninsula. I also thought it was a little noteworthy that the term bitter, Marah, that they use here, that is the same term that's used by Naomi, the mother-in-law of Ruth. Remember when she comes back to Israel and Ruth comes with her, she says, don't call me Naomi anymore, call me Marah, call me bitter, because she's lost her 2 sons. She has nothing except for Ruth. That's how Ruth comes to the promised land, and that's how Ruth becomes the ancestor of King David. So just found it noteworthy that that same word is used again. From Marah, they're going to come to Elim. So in Exodus 15, then they came to Elim, which is where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water. So this sounds very much like what we would call an oasis. This sounds like there actually was a good bit of water when there wasn't anywhere else. There's a couple possible locations of it. Wadi, Gahandal, something to that effect, or Oan Moesa, which is the closer locations theory. So this is a nice oasis area that you can go to. It has the springs, such as what's mentioned. It's got palm trees. They're right there, as was mentioned. So that is one of the possible locations. It's got some evidence to it. This is, even on this route, there's multiple theories about how far apart places were. And this one is a closer locations theory, which is these cities would be closer together. These camp places would be closer together than what other theories say. For example, one might assume you're going 10 kilometers a day, and one might assume 7 kilometers. So once you start talking about a week, you're talking about a pretty significant gap between the 2 possible locations for the cities. Makes sense, right? Okay. But when you start thinking about it on the other side, this is not an army traveling. This is not a little party traveling. This is an entire nation that is traveling. So every grandparent and great-grandparent that can't quite move as swiftly as they used to is on this trip as well. So I do think there's a logic to the idea that maybe they didn't move as quickly as they could have because they're bringing everybody with them at this time. Go ahead, Ed.
And just think how much land, just the party itself would cover. We're talking big people.
Yeah.
From the leaders to the people bringing up the end of it, how far was that? I mean, that is a mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, 5 miles.
It would be a pretty significantly long caravan. For a million people, that is absolutely right. It's going to take a while. I'm, for the sake of the video, I'm trying to do better about repeating what was said so that it makes sense. If you're curious about that. The wadi I wanted to talk about because it's our first chance to explain what a wadi is. This is a valley, a ravine, or a channel that is dry except during rainy season. So if you go here at the wrong time of year, you're going to see nothing. You're going to see just a valley, probably of sand. It's just not going to have a lot. But when there's rain, water starts forming. So this wadi here is very long, and it's a trail where there would be water part of the year. So either place that they are going between these two, it still makes sense that they're following the water. We've kind of beaten that theme up a little bit over the course of this. They definitely have to have water. So in the desert near this area, we see that the Israelites are hangry. In Exodus 16, the whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is in between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and they're asking for meat. I think they already had manna by that point. I forgot to write that down. But I believe they had already had manna for like a month. And then now they're complaining and saying, well, we want meat. When we were back in Egypt, we had meat. We want meat again. This leads, of course, to God sending a wind and quail. Quail are carried by the wind, and the Israelites have all the quail they can eat. I tried to find a good first-hand source for that, but I could only find a second-hand source that says European quail will actually migrate here depending on the season. So they do migrate in this general vicinity, and then the wind could easily blow them from the Red Sea right over to where the Israelites are, and that makes perfect sense. Looking at the Desert of Sin, and this is a map done by Bible Mapper. I'm actively trying to use different sources for maps so that I'm not too locked in on how one group or one person views it. And I don't want to lend too much credence to one of them and say this is the definitive one, because I don't know. But mostly they're following very similar logic, and it makes a lot of sense. But I do like to use the different sources because sometimes they just look different, and you might learn more from one map than you would another. By traveling this route where they're going south along the Red Sea, they're avoiding Egyptian forces. Any kind of defenses that the Egyptians have against invasion, while the Israelites are going in the opposite direction. They're not anywhere near that. This would be along the traditional route to Mount Sinai. Everything that the Israelites are doing since they've left Egypt is about getting to Sinai. Back where God called Moses and said, "You're going to lead my people." Everything since then has been leading the Israelites back to Sinai. It's where Moses' journey began. And that, I think, is an interesting concept to realize is Moses traveled this way first. We saw that in his lifetime, that he goes to Midian. He's called by God at Mount Sinai. He very likely has traveled this way before, and he thus knows the way to lead God's people because he was called for this purpose before he was even born. In the desert, we see in Exodus 17, the water from the rock. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, where there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" Now, everywhere that they have gone so far, there has been water. There was even the bitter water back at Marah, and God gives them drinkable water instead. He converts the bitter water into drinkable water, and they still are complaining about the fact that all of a sudden we're here somewhere where they say there's no water. Well, you've seen all the evidence that God understands water and has taken care of you, and here they are complaining about it. On one hand, you're not going to survive very long without water, so you can understand the grief. But if you're Moses, you're like, guys, he has done this literally everywhere we go, and you're suddenly worried he's forgotten about water? This might be a future project from Brother Mark. The Red Sea Mountain Trail, and it has its own website. This was opened in 2015, so it's a very recent development. And it's a 220 kilometer total trail that you can go on. They've got camels, they've got 4x4s, and I think that was just to say they started this with 4 total 4x4s. So this was a very small scale effort when they started it, but it's a way to kind of have some tourism in the area. And what's interesting about this is I won't tell you you're absolutely going along the path of the Exodus, but it's probably about the closest you're ever going to get. So if you ever want to get really adventurous, you can go to the Sinai Peninsula and travel a 220 kilometer trail. Just be prepared for the weather appropriately, because on December the 8th, the weather was 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So be climate prepared if you decide to take on this adventure. What kind of climate are they in? And as we see these complaints about water, I thought it was worth sidebarring a little bit into this topic. So we see it's hot. We're very clear on the idea, whatever your preferred room temperature is, I think we can all agree that 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the sun is hot. A rainy day is considered at least 0.1 millimeter of water. And the rainy days per month peaks up on this chart as 3. Not 30, 3. That's the rainy season in this area. That's what the climate of Sinai is like. There is not a lot of rain. Mean temperature is between 59 degrees Fahrenheit to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. To try and get as apples to apples as I couldn't find a mean temperature for Sarasota, but I could find one for Tampa, and I said, okay, that's close enough. You'll understand. But for somewhat of a comparison, mean temperature in January was 61 degrees, so a little bit warmer than Sinai, and in July, 85 degrees, so fairly similar. Except the whole air conditioning thing. Yep. And that's from climatecenter.fsu. So, anything else? That's who came up with that chart for us. All right. Sinai is a desert. It's got mountains in the south, of course, as we've seen. It's very sparse population over very long distances. Of course, that was the very first thing we looked at, was that map of how sparse the population is in a lot of these areas. And it's obviously why. It's hot, it's dry. That's not where you want to set up camp. Okay, We're getting close here. There's only a handful of cities that are going to be on the Sinai Peninsula. The Israelites have reached Rephidim, which is after the crossing the Red Sea. This is before Mount Sinai. This is possibly a wadi or a river oasis system. And this is a picture of Wadi Firaun, just because it was a convenient way to kind of see what one might look like. And you don't see a big river that it's built along. And that's go tell it on the mountain.net. Sometimes my font is a little small for myself on here, but I do try to do my best to cite these sources. And then we're going to see a shift. For the first time, the Israelites are going to have to fight somebody. All of a sudden, in Exodus 17, we have the Amalekites attacking. In verse 8, the Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, "Choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands." So Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses has ordered, and Moses and Aaron and Hur were on top of the hill. Amalek, to be the forefather of the Amalekites, is the son of Esau's son Eliphaz. So these are Edomites. These are relatives of the Israelites who should not be doing this, but they are. This is a nomadic people. So why are they, instead of up in Edom, all the way down here? It's an interesting question, and the best explanation I can come up with is, again, the water. If they know the seasons and they know when this wadi will actually have water in it, that may be the time of year that they come out to there, and all of a sudden, here's these million-plus Israelites out there, and they're like, whoa, 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 this is ours. You're not supposed to be here. This is ours. And that prompts the Amalekites to attack. But again, they're attacking their relatives. Now, did they know that at the time? Again, we're being told the spiritual history, not the worldly history. So some of these things aren't important, because whether they knew this was the Israelites or not, you don't just go attack somebody. You're supposed to try and settle these things, civilized. Well, they weren't being very civilized. And it may have been that the Amalekites saw this nomadic-looking people who don't have a lot of armaments because they just came out of bondage in Egypt, but they got a lot of flocks. They've got some gold and stuff that they're carrying around from Egypt that's going to be used for the temple later. They've got some things that a greedy person might want. And perhaps that's the reason why they say, oh, look, we got a bunch of suckers right here that we can go rob. And that may have been the genesis of this actual invasion. But we see the first battle of the Israelites. It's happening somewhere in this area, perhaps. It's before they get to Sinai, but it's close to Sinai. It's on the way. It's likely following this wadi, because that would be a path that the Amalekites, if they're nomadic, would almost certainly know, because they've got to follow the water. And this is where they're going to learn how to fight. They have seen God deliver the victory at the Red Sea, where they didn't have to do anything against the Egyptian army. Here, they see Moses on the hill as God's messenger, showing, kind of giving them a physical manifestation of God's presence, of his protection, and Joshua is leading the battle. And the contrast between this and what they're going to do later is very stark, which we look forward to next week when I do my last lesson for now. So thank you very much.